Can I at least get up there? Nothing builds self-esteem like the love of your church family. But you know what? I'm 36 years old and I can still fit. And I'll tell you why it still fits, because I thought when I got this thing in 1996 that I thought I would want to wear it for the rest of my life, so I got it sized up. Okay, you young folk, listen to the laughter now. I'm a 36-year-old guy wearing his high school letter jacket. Well, let me tell you about this. I got it when I was a sophomore. I lettered in wrestling. And I was so proud. So proud. And wrestling in Texas, up in the northern part of the country, and Oklahoma. So it's Oklahoma and then the northern states along the Canadian border. Wrestling is huge. Wrestling is huge. But in Texas, at least in the 90s, it wasn't. And basically the only people who came to our matches were some of the parents. I had friends on the team that wrestled for Skyline for 4 years. Their parents never came to a match. And so sometimes we might have one or two, and the other side had to be packed with stands. But it was awesome because we won. We were a very good team. And so I lettered my sophomore year, and they didn't give us, Coach Carl didn't want us to get our jackets at the all sports banquet because all the rest of the sports didn't care about us. We had our own shindig where we received our letter jackets. Now, I got my letter jacket in May of 1996. May in Dallas, Texas. May. Okay? Think of the weather down here and just knock it off by a degree or two maybe, because it can get really hot and really humid even by May. The Monday after I got my jacket, everybody who got their new letter jackets wore them to school in May. After school, and didn't take it off for the entire day until we got to practice. And then I went to my friend's house, who lived about a mile from me, and I'm a sophomore in high school, so I'm not driving yet. And so I walk home in May with my jacket on. And I didn't pass out. But I was so proud. I know I was in a sport. By my freshman year, I stunk. And I didn't think I would ever letter. But I was so proud. And I wore this jacket along with my biker jacket, the other jacket that I was really proud of, by the way. The next 2 years, I was waiting for it to get cold just so I can bust out my Letterman jacket, because I wasn't wearing it in the hot anymore. And I would wear it and wear that sucker out. And I went to school in Dallas, but I went to church in the city of Mesquite. And they had all their own, everybody had the same Letterman jacket out there. The Mesquite schools, there was 4 at the time. And so everybody who had a Letterman jacket typically had one of those 4. I was the only one with a Letterman from Dallas. So it was special to me. And again, I thought I would cherish this jacket forever. After all, they make them to last forever, But then I graduated high school. And as I try to tell young people every chance I get, everything that you thought was so important in high school, it stops the night you graduate. It just does not matter anymore. Because I had my Letterman jacket. Then I went to college. Do not wear a high school Letterman jacket to college. Okay? They don't care. I got away with it for a couple of years in community college just because it was the warmest jacket I had. And, again, community college is a little different. You kind of get a mixed cross-cultural thing going on, and, it's okay. It's not, community college, you get a degree, but it's not really college on the outset that you're living and dying by the college team and, all that jazz that goes along with it. But when I went to SFA, I wore my Letterman jacket once. And that was enough. You get the stink eye. Why? Because SFA had their own jackets. They had their own ways of doing it. And again, this is college now. Who cares about high school? That's back in the day. That's what you did a few years ago. It doesn't matter now. You've outgrown that. And so the Letterman jacket went into the closet in my parents' house. Until it gets better. The fall and winter of 2004, 2005, when we moved to New Mexico. I thought I knew what winter was when I lived in Dallas. We moved to New Mexico. And I about froze. I didn't have a jacket that fit me. My mom says, "Here, wear your Letterman." I'm 25 at the time. So I got it about 10 years before. And here I am, a 25-year-old at the time, wearing his high school Letterman to the grocery store and to go get gas and to work and to all this. And, people... And they give you the eye. Why? Because they think you're living in your glory days. And here we are, almost 10 years past the time that you got the thing, and you look like you're still wearing it with pride. I wasn't. I didn't want to freeze. And so again, after I got another jacket to wear, my trench coat, the Letterman went back into the closet, and I just haven't returned it to my parents. And the only reason I bust it out now is for lessons like this. And that's it. Same thing with the wrestling medals I have. Same thing with the yearbook. Time moves on, doesn't it? And we might look like we want to hold on to some glory days. Sometimes it comes off looking sad. You heard the laughter before I said a single word of me walking up. Now think to yourself, why? We know why. Because it's sad to see somebody my age trying to wear his high school jacket. That's why. Because the time comes to mature and to put away childish things, to grow up to adult. We're going to look at some instances this morning because it's important. This is important to me. All the Bible is important to me, don't get me wrong, but if you notice the trend that's been going on the last few years, this attitude in society where we don't want our kids to grow up anymore. We don't want them to grow. We don't want them to mature. Our kids are being bombarded with the message of it is okay to stay a kid forever, like a Peter Pan or some stuff. But that doesn't work, does it? And then our kids grow up, they try to move out of the house, and they don't know what to do. We wonder why. And we'll wonder why, because the society is telling them, you don't have to do it. You don't have to mature. You don't have to grow. We shouldn't expect anything out of our youngins. That's a lie. We're going to talk about that this morning. You find this message everywhere. My kids came home the other day singing a song that drove Sherry and me nuts, so I decided to look at the lyrics, and with today's music, I cut out all the recurring lyrics. Because, if you take a song these days, it might be 4 minutes long, but you take out all the stuff that repeats, it's about 30 seconds. And the song is called Stressed Out. And the lyrics by Tyler Joseph, performed by the 21 Pilots. And I share. I wish I found some better sounds no one's ever heard. I wish I had a better voice that sang some better words. I wish I found some chords in an order that is new. I wish I didn't have to rhyme every time I sang. Isn't he clever? I was told when I get older all my fears would shrink, but now I'm insecure and I care what people think. My name's Blurryface and I care what you think. Wish we could turn back time to the good old days when our mama sang us to sleep, but now we're stressed out. Sometimes a certain smell will take me back when I was young. How come I'm never able to identify where it's coming from? I'd make a candle out of it if I ever found it, try to sell it and never sell out of it. I'd probably only sell one. It'd be to my brother, 'cause we have the same nose, same clothes, homegrown, a stone's throw from a creek we used to roam. But it would remind us when nothing really mattered. Out of student loans and treehouse homes, we all would take the ladder. My name's Blurryface, and I care what you think. Wish we could turn back time to the good old days when our mama sang us to sleep, but now we're stressed out. We used to play pretend to give each other different names. We would build a rocket ship and then we'd fly it far away. Used to dream of outer space, but now they're laughing at our face, saying, "Wake up, you need to make money." We wish we could turn back time to the good old days when our mama sang us to sleep, but now we're stressed out. None of us gets to stay small forever. None of us. And this is not going to be about youngins becoming old ones. We're going to talk about the spiritually young and the spiritually mature. That's what we're talking about today. Because we don't get to stay spiritually young either. That's not the way it's supposed to work. We're supposed to be able and willing and wanting to spiritually grow and spiritually mature. We're not allowed or expected to stay in the spiritual cradle. We need to grow. And we need to walk. We don't get to crawl. We need to learn how to walk. And we learn to how to run. And we need to learn how to sprint towards God. Because that's the only way we are going to make it in this world. Is if we're sprinting towards God. But if we're sitting back in our spiritual bassinets thinking that, oh, everybody else can do it except me. Oh, I can rely on the preacher and the elders and the deacons to do my spiritual growth for me. Or I can have the Bible teachers to teach my kids so I don't have to do it. Or I can do any of this stuff so that I don't have to raise up and do it myself. We are not doing ourselves any favors at all. And in fact, we are making ourselves weaker. This morning we're going to talk about some instances that 4 guys went through. Maybe you've heard of Daniel. Flip over to the book of Daniel. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You think about what these guys went through. And in order for the stories of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in order for them to have power, we've got to remember some things. We've got to remember when they start out in Daniel chapter 1, they were teenagers. They were youngins. In other words, they didn't start their journeys when they were out of the house, so to speak, on their own. But they were minors when they began. And that's what Daniel 1 is about. The first time that they stood up to someone. They weren't home. They were good little Jewish boys, but they were taken away. The Babylonians, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, came down and took them away from their home. Thanks be to God, they were good looking, they had some intelligence about them, and they were able to go into the service of the king. And they were going to enter into a 3-year training process in order to get them ready for court. And as Daniel chapter 1 tells us, being in this role went with it a certain amount of privilege. They were able to eat from the king's table. In other words, they just didn't get some common swill. They were to eat the food that Nebuchadnezzar ate. And Nebuchadnezzar, being the emperor, was served the best food that his empire was able to come up with. They were able to eat from this table. Now, do we think Nebuchadnezzar cared about such little things as Jewish eating law? Clean and unclean food? No, he did not. And so on this table, this king's table, where you can imagine all of the delicacies that were on there, it was not a Jewish-friendly table. But again, let's think about this and put it in perspective. These boys are now away from home. The temple, gone. The priesthood, gone. Daily sacrifices, gone. All the expectations, the teachings, the law that they would be studying from the time they were small to the time they reached this age, that's gone. They're elsewhere. They have been relocated. And if they decided to defile themselves with the choice food from the king's table, nobody would know about it. And after all, remember, these are teenage boys. You ever seen teenage boys turn down a meal of really good food? Goodness sakes, I remember some guys I used to hang with and when I was in high school, and they were the size of broomsticks. And yet we would go to Taco Bell. Remember back in Taco Bell that you could get a bean burrito for 50 or 60 cents a piece? Yeah, I'm not joking. You know, they had the 50-cent menu, the 75-cent menu, and the dollar menu back when I was in high school. I knew guys, they would take a tray and they would load that thing to about this deep in Taco Bell food. Oh. And consume that entire tray, that meal. Not gain an ounce and feel fantastic. By the way, if you're a young guy listening, you don't get to keep that metabolism unless you work really hard on it. So appreciate it. But they would consume that entire meal that night and feel fantastic. Boys like to eat. Once the growth spurts and the puberty hits. These guys were presented with a table filled with the best, no joke, the best food in the empire. How would we do if we were separated from our parents? If we were separated, so to speak, from our religion, the temple, everything that made our people special in the eyes of God, that's gone now. How would we do in the face of this temptation? Daniel was the one up front, but also Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They say, no. No. They say, Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. It would have been so easy for the boys to say, well, you know, we are kids and we are in Nebuchadnezzar's court and he has power over us and, you know, that looks really tasty, that pig. And let's just give it. They didn't. Why? Because at such a young age, there was already a spiritual maturity. There was already a spiritual maturity at a young age that told them that, you know what, even though we're away from our homeland, and we're away from our families, and we're away from the temple, and we're away from the priesthood, and we're away from all this, what God says still matters. And they refused to take part in it. It said in verse 15, at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. I bet the four of them were very popular. To these four young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. They were blessed. Why? Because they stuck to their guns and they maintained a relationship with God above relationship to man, or the idea of pleasing a pagan king. At a young age, maturity was there. At a young age, they were ready to stand up for what was right. Now think about yourself, or think about your kids when the time you were a teenager. And again, in this lesson, hopefully you know me well enough to know I'm not putting Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego on a pedestal for us to look to them. Look at the relationship they had with God. That's what made what they did in the book of Daniel possible. Was that they didn't look to themselves, they looked to God. If you were a teenager, back in your teenage days, I know you have to go back a bit, Jesse. Would we stand strong? Think about your kids if you got teenagers, or you got kids about to be teenagers. We pray for you. Would you trust them to move off on their own, and for them to maintain diligence and do what is right? And the answer is no. Then what's missing? A spiritual maturity. Spiritual maturity. Not their parents. Daniel and the three, they didn't do what was right because, well, our parents were good Jewish people. They were obedient to God, so we'll just follow their religion. No, it doesn't work that way, and it has never worked that way. Relationship with God does not go down in the DNA. It's not in the genes. Relationship to God has to happen on a personal level for each and every one of us. You don't get to get it from anybody else. They had a close personal relationship with God, and that allowed them to face horrors. Horrors, you say? That sounds very melodramatic. Oh, yeah. Nothing. No, that wouldn't be. It wouldn't be like they faced anything awful, like being burned to death in a fiery furnace, I guess. You jump over to Daniel 3, that's exactly what happened. Daniel chapter 3. The first instance involved all four of them, and then the next two instances, we got Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in one instance, and then we have Daniel in another. There was a command that came out in Daniel chapter 3 by Nebuchadnezzar. In verse 4 it says, Then the herald proclaimed loudly, This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. Overkill? Maybe, yeah, pretty much. But Nebuchadnezzar had that right because he was emperor. Golden statue. Whenever you hear the music throughout the land, you bow down and worship the golden statue right now on the spot. I don't care what you're doing. If you don't, you will be thrown into a fiery furnace in which you will die. Okay. Bow down to the altar and live. Refuse and burn to death. This is the option. Now, what do you do? What do we do? Again, put yourself in that situation and be honest with yourself. What would you do? Truth be told, people are facing this kind of choices today. So don't sit back and think, well, I'll never have to make that choice. We might. Because that kind of stuff is happening now. Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So not only do we have the threat of death hanging over our heads, we also now have peer pressure. And you know what? Peer pressure is strong. Peer pressure is strong. If somebody's sitting there telling us, you have to do something, many people say, okay, and they do it. They actually came out with an experiment back in the 40s or the 50s. And the experiment was centered around, it was a social experiment. The experiment was centered around a shock test. And what happens was that you would have this guy come in, and they would think, these two guys would think that they're both taking an experiment. And the experiment was on memory. A gentleman would go into another room, and one guy would sit here at this table that had a series of old school toggle switches. Okay? And there was a number over each of them that represented volts. Another gentleman went into the room where it was believed he was being hooked up to electrodes. And then what would happen is that the person in here with the toggle switches, he was giving a test on memory to the person in the other room. And he would read off a series of words. And then the person in the other room was supposed to give them back through memory. And if he missed one, he would get a shock. Now, before he went in, the guy gave this line that said, well, I have a heart condition, and I'm hooked up to a pacemaker. Will these shocks bother me, hurt me? And the test giver said, no, you'll be fine. So they lead him to the other room. And so as the test goes, the toggle switches get thrown, and they get stronger as they go along. And there's actually an area on the board that says danger, because now we're getting into danger territory. And the guy in the other room would start complaining, okay, don't hit me again, I'm starting to feel wobbly. And the test taker says, no, go ahead, he's fine. You go ahead and do it. You go ahead and do it. And they found that the result was, it was a sham. The guy in the other room who was getting zapped, he was in on the scam. The test was on the guy flipping switches. And the question was, how far would a person under the idea of obeying orders go? If he's being told, you must do something, what the odds are of him doing it? And this was coming after the Nuremberg trials with Germany and the guys who were on trial saying, we were just following orders when we massacred the Jews. Well, they tested this theory, and they found that most people would continue on. Just because some guy in a lab coat says, you need to keep doing what you're doing, he's fine. So when you have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being told that you bow down and you worship an altar or an idol, when you start hearing music, not only do they have the authorities telling them this, but they have everybody around in the city and the nation of Babylon dropping down and worshiping idols at the sound of music. Authoritative pressure combined with peer pressure. What would we do? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they said, well, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. Why? Because they grew up, and they grew up with the law of Moses. And the law of Moses said, do not bow down and worship any idol. No other God besides me. And even though their nation was gone, even though their temple was gone, and even though Jerusalem was gone, and even though they're away from their families, and even though nobody would ever know, they still said, no, this is not right. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound, the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is this true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I have made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? You ever have an emperor yell at you? I can tell you right now, you have not. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." Now remember, Nebuchadnezzar can do quite literally anything he wants to. Nobody tells this guy no. And he could kill you in front of the entire population of Babylon and get away with it. Listen to how these guys are speaking. "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and He will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if He does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Listen to what they're saying. They don't know what God's going to do. "We will not worship your idol. The God we serve can save us from you, but even if He doesn't," in other words, even if we die anyways, "we will not serve you." Flat, absolute. Not going to do it. Regardless if we live or die. Their obedience to God was not based on if God was going to save them. Their obedience to God was, God says no to this kind of behavior. That means I'm not going to do it. And lo and behold, what happened? In verse 19, "Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers," this is verse 20 by the way, of chapter 3, "and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and throw them into a blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent that the furnace was so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like the son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out! Come here!" And guess what? Nebuchadnezzar learned something that day. Verse 28, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent His angel and rescued His servants. They trusted in Him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Well, he was on the right path. Nebuchadnezzar had I'm not saying go out and tell him, "The preacher said that if you don't come to church with me, we're going to cut you into bits and tear your houses down." He was on the right. Remember, he was pagan and he still had a lot to learn. But the point is, they defied and they lived. They defied an edict and they lived. And even if they didn't live, don't miss this point. We're not praising their behavior because they lived. They were okay with dying. They were not going to worship that idol because it was wrong. And their parents weren't there to tell them that it was okay, and the preacher wasn't there to tell them that it was wrong, and the rabbis weren't there to tell them it was wrong, and the priests weren't there to tell them that it was wrong either. It's because they grew in maturity that they were able to stand up against emperors. They stood up against emperors because of the faith they had. Daniel, in Daniel 6, Daniel in the lion's den. We teach our kids about this in Sunday school, but then we leave it. Why? Daniel in the lion's den is not a Sunday morning Bible school story. It's for all of us. Babylon fades away because Nebuchadnezzar's son is an idiot. And so the Persian Medes took over. Lo and behold, Daniel, who was a great servant for Nebuchadnezzar, tried to be a good servant for Nebuchadnezzar's brain-dead son, became a good servant to the Persian Mede Emperor. And lo and behold, even though the ownership changed of the empire, Daniel's position was still on the rise, to the point of jealousy of others. King Darius liked Daniel, but Daniel's contemporaries did not because of jealousy. So, they concocted a plan. In Daniel chapter 6, verse 6, it says, "So the administrators and the satraps went as a group to the king and said, 'O King Darius, live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed,'" "have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, O king, issue the decree and put it in writing so it cannot be altered in accordance with the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed." So King Darius put the decree in writing. Why did they do this? Because they didn't like Daniel, but they also knew Daniel was beyond corruption. So they realized that the only way they could get Daniel out of the way was if it had something to do with his worship to his God. Let's attack prayer. Why? Because Daniel was known. He was known for his praying life. Verse 10, "Now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home, packed his bags, and hid in the closet for the next 30 days so that he would not be caught doing anything wrong." No, that's not what it says. It says he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. "Did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days anyone who prayed to any god or man except you, O king, would be thrown into the lion's den?" The king answered, "The decree stands in accordance with the laws of the Persians and the Medes, which cannot be repealed." Then they said to the king, "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day." There's the question. If you're caught praying, you die. Are we going to pray? And if we are going to pray, whom are we going to pray to? Daniel made a choice. He made a choice. And his choice landed him in the lion's den. Now again, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Daniel did not really know what God was going to do. And in the long run, it does not care. We can look at these examples where God has saved life, but truth be told, God has also let die many people who worshipped Him as well. Does this make God bloodthirsty, picky, and choosy? He only saves His favorites? No. The reality is that for the mature Christian, it does not matter what God does. Because even if these guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Daniel, whom God did save, they died. They still died. But the point is, when faced with that ultimate choice, what did they pick? They made their choice before the salvation came. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego decided before they were thrown into the furnace. Daniel decided before he was thrown into the lion's den. And God saved because they had a relationship with God that was not based on anything that came before them. It was their relationship. And it didn't matter where they lived or whom they worked for. It did not matter. Their relationship with God did not change. They maintained their strength, their comfort, their faith, and their realization that, if I die today because of following God, or if I die later, it does not matter because I will be with God. And that's where I want to be anyway. This is maturity. This is growing up. And if we are raising our kids, or if we have not reached that level of spiritual maturity which says, from this day forward I am going to live for God, instead of trying to seek comfort and wealth and a home here on earth, this is the maturity we need to reach. If we're not seeking this maturity, if we're not seeking this relationship with God, we're walking around as 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, and 90-year-olds wearing our high school Letterman jacket, trying to hold on to glory days long ago where stuff didn't even matter. We are supposed to be seeking maturity. We are supposed to be seeking a relationship with God. Our relationship with God. We need to grow up. What happened to Daniel? Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. King Darius, who liked Daniel, spent all night alone because he knew he'd been trapped. He knew he'd been duped by these other guys. Next morning, he goes running down to the lion's den, opens it up. Daniel, Daniel, was God able to save you? And guess what? Daniel lived. But again, that's just kind of the sidebar. The choice was made before he entered that lion's den. Brothers and sisters, if we're sitting here today and you're expecting me to say something brilliant that's going to influence your relationship with God, and thereby you don't have to do anything with your relationship with God for this entire week, nobody's that good. If we're sitting here today thinking that I don't have to make any sort of personal decisions or seek to help the relationship that I have with God grow based on my time, my efforts, me putting forth something in order to have this relationship with God, you're going to be disappointed. For those who truly walk with God, this world can throw anything it wants at us, and God can see us through it. It might not even be the way in which we think it's going to happen, but He can still get us through it to the point of death. But it only works if we are willing to hold on to God wherever we go. And it doesn't matter how close our parents were with God, or it doesn't matter how close our great-grandparents or our grandparents were with God. That has nothing to do with it. It doesn't matter what kind of relationship with God our friends have, or our co-workers have, or our bosses have. It doesn't matter. What's our relationship with God like? And can our relationship with God get us through the trials of life? It can. If we nurture that relationship during the good times of life, it can get us through the bad ones. It's sometimes said the grass is greener on the other side. Well, if the grass is greener on the other side, it's because somebody has more of a water bill than you have, or somebody's done some fertilizing. Maybe it's time we did some fertilizing and some watering on our own grass, so that it can be green too. God wants a relationship with us so much. But are we willing to put forth the time and the effort to have it? It's time to take off the letter jackets. Even though they look impressive and we had a great time, it's time to take them off. It's time to grow up. It's time to mature. And through study, and through prayer, through meditation, through time, that relationship and maturity can grow. But it won't happen by itself. We must put forth effort. At this time, we'd like to offer the invitation to those of you who might be hurting or suffering with something. We would love to comfort you and assist you in any way that we possibly can. Or you might wish to put your Savior on in baptism. We had a baptism Friday night up here. Nephew of Manny and Blanca put his Savior on in Christ. It was beautiful to behold. Maybe you haven't taken that first step in having a relationship with Christ. We would love to assist you with that. Maybe the time has come and the time is ready for you to put on Christ as your Savior, to have your sins washed away, to begin anew, to be buried with Christ, and arise a new creature. We would love to assist you with that today if you decide to be baptized. But whatever needs you have, would you please come down as we stand and as we sing.